People think betrayal is loud, that it comes crashing through the front door, uninvited and obvious. But the truth is, it whispers. It nods. It shakes your hand with a smile while stabbing you softly beneath the desk. I learned that the day Dr. Maxwell Kern looked me straight in the eye and said, "You're just a therapist, Darren, not an innovator." His words echoed in that sterile white office on the 17th floor of the Ridgeview Behavioral Institute in Austin, Texas. The city skyline shimmered behind him like a false promise, sunlight bouncing off the windows as if the world outside wasn't crumbling inside me. Dr. Kern's manicured fingers casually flipped through my printed therapy notes, the ones I had agonized over, bled into, lived with. He skimmed them like someone reading a takeout menu. "This little treatment approach you've been tinkering with," he continued, barely hiding his disdain, "isn't revolutionary. But we'll consider integrating it into our standard protocols. Under the Ridgeview name, of course." I didn't speak. "My name is Darren Cole. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 7 years, I've worked as a licensed clinical social worker, specializing in adolescent anxiety and trauma disorders. I joined Ridgeview fresh out of graduate school, hungry to help kids like the one I once was, scared, silenced, stuck. What Dr. Kern dismissed as tinkering was actually 3 years of meticulous development, something I called the Structured Anxiety Transition Protocol. It combined cognitive behavioral therapy, trauma-informed peer dynamics, and a progressive mindfulness system that helped teens navigate anxiety through what I described as resilience ladders. Safe steps upward, small wins that led them out of mental darkness. I had seen kids who refused to speak in groups become peer mentors. Teens who used to self-harm learned to journal and ground themselves during panic attacks. I had watched breakthroughs happen in real time. This wasn't theoretical. This was transformation. But all of that was just ink to Dr. Kern. He didn't see progress, he saw branding. Leverage. A keynote opportunity. And he wasn't done. "We'll list you as part of the development team, of course," he said, eyes still on my notes. "But this level of innovation, it needs administrative leadership, vision, strategy, not just enthusiasm from a floor-level counselor." My jaw tightened. I wanted to speak, to scream, but I didn't. Not yet. Not in that room. Because in that moment, I realized something that made my chest go hollow. This wasn't about my work. It was about power. Dr. Kern hadn't run a therapy session in over 5 years. His doctorate was in health systems management. He came from a world of funding decks and board meetings, not suicidal teenagers and midnight crisis calls. And yet, here he was preparing to steal every ounce of meaning I had poured into this method and rename it as his own. He even had a name already. The Kern Unified Response Framework. It sounded sleek, marketable, soulless. I clenched my hands beneath the desk. I thought of the first time I stayed late with a patient who'd scratched "I don't want to be here anymore" into her forearm. I thought of the Saturday mornings I gave up to host peer circles for kids who had no one else. I thought of my own younger brother, who had dropped out of school at 15 because he couldn't find a counselor who understood his anxiety. This method was built on live pain, on healing. It was born from the invisible work, the kind you can't present on a slide deck or sell at a symposium. But Dr. Kern saw only the opportunity, not the origin. That day, he invited me, ordered me, to attend the National Behavioral Health Conference in Salt Lake City next month. As support staff, I'd be there, he said, to observe how leadership brings frontline innovation to the world stage. Support staff. It was my method, my model, my research, and I was being told to carry his laptop bag while he sold it as his. That evening, I sat alone in the break room, staring at the vending machine like it held answers. I didn't even hear my phone buzz the first 3 times. It was Brianna, my girlfriend, a trauma nurse. She'd been worried about me for weeks. "You're giving everything to that place," she said the night before. "What are they giving you in return?" I didn't have an answer then. But that night, in the silence of betrayal, I found one. They weren't giving me anything. They were taking everything. And something inside me snapped, not like a branch breaking, but like a lock opening. If Dr. Kern wanted to steal my work, he was going to have to live up to every promise he made with it. I knew the structure inside and out. I had the data. I had the real relationships. I had the proof that this wasn't just a method, it was a movement. And if he wanted a war, he just started one. The Salt Lake City air was dry and sharp that March morning, the kind that wakes you up the moment you step outside. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the conference center, watching professionals stream in with purpose, name badges glinting, coffee in hand, ambition in their stride. They were here for breakthroughs, for revolutions in mental health. And I was about to watch a fraud present mine. I didn't wear my badge at first. There was no point in reminding anyone I was just support staff. Inside, the main hall buzzed with anticipation. The banner above the stage read, "The Future of Adolescent Mental Health Treatment." And there he was, Dr. Maxwell Kern, navy suit pressed, hair slicked back like a politician, confidence oozing like it belonged to him. He stepped up to the microphone and smiled the way only liars smile when they know they're about to get away with something. The Kern Unified Response Framework, he began, is the culmination of innovative frontline research and administrative oversight. A protocol designed to build structured anxiety relief through progressive engagement techniques. I sat in the back row. No notebook, no tablet, just rage and memory. He was quoting me, word for word, my terminology, my patient outcomes, my entire methodology that I had pieced together over years of broken teenagers and tearful breakthroughs, now neatly packaged under his name. He clicked through slides filled with my data, charts I had agonized over, quotes pulled from patient feedback forms I had hand-collected. At one point, he even described the resilience ladders, a concept I'd sketched out one night at 2 a.m. on the back of a diner receipt. He had stolen everything but the scars. And the audience? They loved him. Heads nodded. Phones recorded. Hands scribbled notes. I saw therapists from clinics across the country mouthing wow to each other. By the time the Q&A started, I felt like I was being dissected alive in silence. A woman in a gray blazer raised her hand. Dr. Kern, how did you develop the confidence to try such an unorthodox method with high-risk adolescents? He gave a small, thoughtful smile. The kind of smile people trust. Well, he said, innovation requires risk. But with the right administrative structure and vision, risk becomes leadership. I bit my lip until I tasted blood. Leadership? He hadn't stayed up nights, wondering if a panic-stricken kid was going to run out the door and into traffic. He hadn't held the silence in the room when a teenager finally spoke their trauma out loud. He didn't know what it meant to fail, then return the next day anyway. But he was getting applause for bravery he'd never earned. After the talk, I stayed back, tucked behind a pillar near the hallway as Dr. Kern fielded business cards like a celebrity. Other directors swarmed him. They wanted licensing deals, training workshops, keynote appearances. It was surreal. My work was becoming a brand, just not mine. But then something shifted in me. Not grief, not even anger. Something colder, sharper. He had made a fatal mistake. Dr. Kern hadn't just stolen my method. He had promised it would deliver the same results. Publicly, on record, in front of hundreds of professionals who would be watching for data, tracking outcomes, expecting peer-reviewed validation. And he had none of that, because he didn't understand the core of the method. He didn't know how the pieces fit together. He couldn't replicate what he hadn't lived. That night, back in my hotel room, I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop and began organizing every file I had: session notes, success metrics, patient surveys, peer reviews, emails, time-stamped innovation drafts. Everything. If he wanted credit, he'd have to survive the scrutiny that came with it. And I'd make sure he couldn't. Back in Austin, things at Ridgeview were different. The air buzzed with congratulatory energy. Dr. Kern had returned as a rising star. He was scheduling interviews, fielding calls from journals, even planning a new department centered around his protocol. But I wasn't scared anymore, because while he gave the same talk over and over, I was evolving the work. I started inviting colleagues into my sessions, not as witnesses, but as collaborators. I asked for their feedback, documented their observations, kept meticulous records. Every improvement to the protocol had their signatures, timestamps, recorded discussions. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was building a case. My relationship with Brianna had felt the strain. She was always patient, but even she had limits. One night, after I came home late for the fourth time in a week, She sat me down on our kitchen table, arms crossed. "You're turning this into a crusade," she said quietly. "I'm worried you're becoming more obsessed with taking him down than building your work up." I paused, chewing on her words. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was about more than work now. Maybe it was personal. "It's not revenge," I finally said. "It's restoration." Brianna looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "Just promise me, Darren, don't lose yourself in the process." That promise stuck with me, because I knew what it was like to be lost, to lose belief in your own voice. I wasn't going back there. I was going to finish what I started, and I was going to do it so thoroughly that the truth would be undeniable, even if it took years, even if I had to burn every bridge in that clinic to light the way. 6 months passed, and during those 6 months, I watched Dr. Kern become a star. He was on panels now, talking about adolescent intervention like he'd lived it, publishing blog posts through the clinic's PR team, giving interviews on podcasts, getting quoted in psychology newsletters. The future of adolescent care, they called him. But in the therapy rooms, the real ones, not the ones behind a microphone, he was absent. I was still the one sitting in front of trembling kids who thought the walls were caving in. I was still the one adjusting my tone mid-sentence because a teenager flinched when I spoke too loud. I was still the one building trust inch by inch with kids who hadn't trusted anyone in years. That was the difference between us. I practiced healing. He practiced performance. But he had made a critical mistake at the conference. He made promises. Public, recorded, time-stamped promises. He claimed his current unified response framework would revolutionize adolescent treatment and improve anxiety outcomes within a year. And now, those journals and institutions wanted proof. One Thursday morning, he summoned me to his office. For the first time in years, he looked unsettled. His smile was thin, forced. He held a printed email like it might catch fire. Darren. He corrected himself, flustered. "I need your help preparing some data." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of data?" "Outcome tracking. Long-term results. A journal wants to feature a program. They just need some supporting numbers, success rates, patient feedback. The usual." The usual? He had no idea what metrics I'd been tracking, because he'd never cared until now. "What version of the protocol do they want data for?" I asked. "The one you presented last spring? Or the updates I've been developing this quarter?" That paused him, because he didn't know there were updates. Didn't know that the work had evolved while he was out branding the stolen version. "Whichever version you think reflects best," he said, waving it off. That was the moment I knew I had him, because in his mind, innovation was a product. Static, marketable. Something to be wrapped in a bow and sold at scale. But real innovation, real therapy was alive. Messy, evolving. That night, I didn't prep anything for his journal request. Instead, I prepared something else. A full timeline of my development process, every handwritten sketch, every email draft, every treatment session with documented adjustments. I logged patient testimonials, anonymized, colleague endorsements, and even workshop discussions I had conducted with other staff. I included version dates, comparison notes, footnotes, cross-referenced improvements, and I stored everything in multiple cloud drives, shared with 2 trusted colleagues and Brianna. The next day, I made a call. Dr. Jennifer Walsh was a clinical researcher at the University of Texas. I had met her once at a workshop on adolescent neurodevelopment, and she had followed my work since the conference. She'd reached out discreetly weeks ago, saying she was concerned about the authorship discrepancies she'd noticed. I knew what she meant. She invited me to coffee. "You've been quiet about what happened," she said, "but I think your work needs to speak now. Not just louder, but publicly." And that's when it clicked. If Dr. Kern had stolen my voice, then the only way to get it back wasn't to whisper in the shadows. It was to put in print, peer-reviewed, academically validated, time-stamped truth. We began planning a formal research paper together. Her university would provide institutional support, ethical oversight, and access to statistical teams. I would provide the method, the notes, the case studies, and the soul. The paper would do more than expose theft. It would prove something deeper, that my method didn't work because it was catchy or buzzworthy or neatly packaged for conferences. It worked because it came from the field, from the raw, painful, daily commitment to helping kids heal. Over the next few months, I worked with brutal focus. Every session was documented, every improvement analyzed. I started naming the new branches of my framework. One dealt with social media-induced anxiety, another with trauma-linked avoidance cycles. I called one technique anxiety archaeology, where patients map the origins of their fears across time, context, and environment. It was intricate, honest, real. Meanwhile, Dr. Kern kept performing. He recycled the same slides from Salt Lake City at other conferences. Same stats, same script, no updates, no questions asked. But I could feel the walls closing in, because every public claim he made was now traceable. And every trace pointed somewhere he didn't expect, to me. The research paper was submitted to the American Journal of Clinical Psychology in early spring. It was titled, Structured Anxiety Transition Protocol, a ground-level innovation in adolescent treatment with long-term clinical outcomes. Dr. Walsh insisted on listing me as the lead author. She didn't hesitate. She knew the truth, and more importantly, she knew how truth worked. It wasn't just what you said. It was when you said it, where you said it, who said it with you. The peer review process was brutal, as expected. They asked for anonymized patient data, implementation procedures, statistical variance tracking across demographic groups. Everything. I had it all. When you've had your life's work stolen, you either crumble or you catalog every breath it ever took to build it. I chose the latter. 3 months later, the paper was accepted. 3 weeks after that, it was published. The moment it went live, I got a call from the Ridgeview front desk. Dr. Kern wants to see you. Urgently. I took my time. When I walked into his office, he wasn't smiling. He was holding a printed copy of the journal article, hands trembling ever so slightly. His usual posture, commanding, smug, was gone. The air was different, heavy, tense. The confidence that had wrapped him like armor was cracking. "This is a serious problem, Darren," he said. His voice didn't have its usual edge. It wavered, sounded older. "You've created confusion in the professional community. People are asking questions about our clinic's intellectual property." I stayed quiet, let the silence stretch. It made him uncomfortable. "Good. The paper is accurate," I said finally. "Every outcome, every source, every date is verifiable. There's no confusion, just clarity." He slammed the paper on the desk. "You developed this while under contract here, using our patients, our resources." I had been waiting for that line. I pulled a folder from my bag, one I'd prepared months earlier. "My contract," I said, flipping to the highlighted clause, "specifies that therapeutic innovations created independently, off-site or off-hours, retain author rights unless otherwise agreed upon in writing. And here's the log of my development timeline." I laid it all out. Timestamps, drafts written at home, sessions recorded during voluntary after-hours pilot programs, personal funds used to purchase assessment tools, witness statements from colleagues. I wasn't just prepared, I was airtight. He stared down at the pages like they were landmines. "You don't understand what you've done," he muttered. "This will hurt the clinic. You've undermined everything we've built." I looked him dead in the eye. "No, Maxwell. You did that the moment you decided your ambition was more important than the truth." He had no response. That meeting was the last time he looked me in the eye, because the consequences came fast. Within 3 weeks, the Journal of Adolescent Mental Health, the same one Dr. Kern had courted for months, reached out publicly, requesting clarification about the similarities between the Kern framework and the SAT protocol from our paper. They weren't subtle about it. Authorship discrepancy was the term they used. It was the beginning of a storm. Clinicians who had attended Dr. Kern's conference presentations began to piece together the timeline. Emails circulated. Forums buzzed. Questions multiplied. How could his protocol match the published one so precisely? Why wasn't he listed as a co-author? Where was his data? The Ridgeview Board of Directors launched a quiet internal review, but there was nothing quiet about the fallout. A few of my colleagues pulled me aside in the break room. "I always thought it was weird how he suddenly had a fully formed method after you've been working on yours for years. I feel sick. We promoted that at conferences. Others stayed silent. Not out of guilt, but fear. They knew where this was heading. 2 months later, Dr. Kern was placed on administrative leave pending a full ethics investigation by the National Association of Behavioral Health Professionals. They called it alleged academic misattribution. I called it justice in motion. The clinic scrambled to maintain its reputation. But the grants they had received, based on Dr. Kern's so-called innovation, came under review. Funders wanted transparency. Insurance providers grew hesitant. And with each inquiry, the house he built started shaking harder. But me? I kept working. I stayed late. Not for punishment, but for purpose. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't defending my past. I was building my future. The most powerful thing I learned through it all wasn't about revenge. It was about proof. People can steal your words, your work, your ideas, but they cannot sustain the weight of a truth they never earned. When a system starts to collapse, it doesn't begin with noise. It starts with whispers, emails unanswered, meetings canceled, calls left hanging in voicemail. By the time the headlines arrived, the foundation had already cracked. Mental health director under investigation for protocol misrepresentation. Austin clinic faces scrutiny over grant-funded program. Innovation or appropriation. SAT protocol sparks ethics debate. Dr. Maxwell Kern's name was everywhere, and not the way he liked. The very spotlight he had worked so hard to stand beneath was now exposing every corner he tried to keep in shadow. Ridgeview's public relations team scrambled to contain the fire. They issued bland, carefully worded statements. We remain committed to transparency and the highest ethical standards. The clinic is cooperating fully with the review process. The allegations relate to an internal procedural matter, but it was too late. Truth had momentum now, and people were listening. At a staff meeting, one of the senior therapists, Dr. Nguyen, a quiet man who rarely spoke unless necessary, stood up and asked the question out loud. If Darren developed the SAT protocol, why was Kern listed as the sole presenter at 3 major conferences? Silence followed, and in that silence, power shifted. Not to me. Not yet, but away from him. The grant committee that had awarded Ridgeview nearly $800,000 for innovative adolescent treatments launched a formal audit. They demanded a full accounting of program implementation timelines, team structures, and documented development chains. I knew what they'd find. Dr. Kern had always thought confidence could cover for gaps, that polished slides and buzzwords could outshine substance. But in clinical practice, in science, paper trails matter. I had mine. He didn't. Around this time, I got a message on LinkedIn. It was short, from someone who had attended the Salt Lake conference a year ago. We were all fooled. Your work deserved better. Glad the truth is coming out. There were more like that. Quiet affirmations. Subtle nods. No fanfare. But every message was another weight lifted from my chest. Then came the invitation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh forwarded it to me. The National Adolescent Mental Health Association invites Darren Cole to present the keynote address at our upcoming summit in Chicago. Topic: evidence-based innovation from the ground floor. It took me a full minute to read it twice. They weren't asking me to clean up someone else's mess. They were asking me to lead. I thought about declining at first. I wasn't used to stages, to attention. My work had always been about other people's voices, helping teenagers find theirs. I didn't want the spotlight, but I also realized something else. This wasn't about me. It was about every frontline therapist who'd ever been overlooked. Every counselor whose methods were quietly co-opted by administrators with shinier degrees. Every professional who stayed up at night wondering if what they were doing mattered. I had to say yes, and I had to speak for all of us. Brianna cried when I told her. You didn't just survive this, she said, cupping my face in her hands. You turned it into something better. That night, I opened a blank document and typed the first words of my speech. I'm not here because I followed the rules. I'm here because I followed the results. As the summit approached, I worked late refining the speech, drawing on years of sessions, breakthroughs, failures, and insights. I included anonymized stories, like the boy who hadn't spoken in a group for 4 months and finally shared his story through poetry, or the girl who used to check her pulse 50 times a day, who now taught mindfulness exercises to others. I didn't mention Dr. Kern by name. I didn't need to. The truth was in the outcomes. The SAT protocol wasn't just a method. It was a mirror. It reflected what was possible when empathy met structure, when science met soul, when therapy became transformation. I stepped onto that stage in Chicago wearing the same gray jacket I wore every day at Ridgeview. No tie, no performance, just the truth. And when I looked out across the room, hundreds of professionals, many of whom had once clapped for a thief, I felt no bitterness, only purpose. There's a strange kind of silence that happens before you speak in front of a crowd. Not the kind in the room, your body, your breath settles, your thoughts align. It's the calm before your truth takes shape and sound. That's what I felt standing backstage in Chicago. Not fear, not anxiety, conviction. The moderator called my name. I stepped into the lights, took the podium, and for a moment, I saw their faces, not just professionals, but people. Tired people, passionate people, people who had sat with crying kids and second-guessed themselves 1,000 times. I spoke, not from notes, not from slides, from memory. 3 years ago, I began working on a method to help adolescents who didn't fit neatly into diagnostic checklists. Kids who were anxious, yes, but also ashamed, overwhelmed, and often overlooked by the very systems meant to help them. I didn't create this protocol in a lab or behind an executive desk. I built it between after-school sessions, weekend pilot groups, midnight breakthroughs, and heartbreaking failures. I didn't imagine resilience ladders. I witnessed them in the hands of kids who climbed them rung by rung, sometimes falling, sometimes freezing, but always trying. This method didn't start as innovation. It started as necessity. Because when a teenager sits across from you and says they want to disappear, you either get creative or you lose them. No one moved. Not a cough. Not a rustle of paper. Just a stillness that felt sacred. I ended the speech with one line. The future of mental health care doesn't come from the top down. It rises from the floor, quietly, stubbornly, through the work no one applauds. And then they applauded. A standing ovation. I didn't feel proud. I felt seen. That night, Dr. Jennifer Walsh introduced me to 2 clinic directors who wanted to implement the SAT protocol. But this time it was under my name, with credit, with published guidelines, with ethical oversight. We talked partnerships, not ownership. And I knew this was the beginning of something real. Back in Austin, things moved quickly. The ethics board concluded its investigation. Dr. Maxwell Kern was officially found in violation of professional conduct standards for misrepresentation of authorship and intentional academic plagiarism. He lost his position at Ridgeview. Worse, for him, his credibility was gone. No clinic, no institution, no grant board wanted to be associated with someone who had built a reputation on someone else's foundation. He disappeared from the field almost overnight. There was no dramatic exit, no apology, just silence. But I didn't need closure from him. I got mine in a far different way. One afternoon, about 3 months later, I received a letter at the clinic. It was handwritten, shaky penmanship from a former patient. Mr. Cole, you probably don't remember me, but I was in your Thursday peer group 2 years ago. I was the one who never spoke, the one who kept my hood up even indoors. You once said something like, "You don't have to talk yet. Just show up. That's your start." I kept showing up. Eventually I talked. I'm in college now, studying psychology. You saved my life. I wanted you to know. Sincerely, James. I read it twice, then a third time. That letter sat in my desk drawer, right on top of every award or certificate I ever received after the scandal broke. Because that letter was the only one that mattered. It reminded me why the work had to be protected. Why credit wasn't about ego, but responsibility. If someone else had claimed it, they'd never know how to carry it. They'd never understand what it took to earn the trust of someone like James. That's why the most powerful revenge is not humiliation. It's continuation. Dr. Kern's name faded from conversations. But the SAT protocol lived on. Not as a product, not as a pitch deck, but as a movement that started quietly in one small room with one scared kid and one stubborn therapist who refused to let go. 1 year after the Chicago keynote, I turned in my resignation. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't spiteful. Ridgeview had changed. New leadership, New policies, a subtle but genuine effort to clean up the damage left behind. But some things, once broken, never fit the same way again. I packed my things into 2 boxes, not because I owned little, but because what mattered wasn't physical. The method I'd created, that came with me. But so did something deeper, something I didn't even realize I'd reclaimed. My voice, not the one that made speeches, the one that sat across from teenagers and said, "You're not broken." The one that told colleagues, "Let's try it this way." The one that once hesitated to speak up when credit was quietly handed elsewhere, but no longer would. Brianna met me outside the building. I carried the boxes. She carried coffee. "You sure?" she asked. I looked back at the Ridgeview sign one last time. "I'm not running from something," I said. "I'm running toward it." We opened the clinic 6 months later, small, quiet, tucked into the east side of Austin in a building that used to be a bookstore. I called it the Bridge Project. It wasn't just a nod to the resilience ladders and anxiety bridges in the protocol. It was a promise. A place where kids could cross from fear to strength, where therapists were given tools and respect in equal measure, where innovation didn't need permission, just results. We started with 4 staff members, all former colleagues, all people who had seen what happened and chose truth over comfort. We didn't take shortcuts. We didn't market buzzwords. We just worked. Word spread, and eventually other clinics started reaching out. Not to steal, not to rebrand, but to learn, to train with us, to bring the model to kids in their own cities. Each time I shared the framework, I did it with full transparency. Open source therapy, because that's how healing should move, freely, intentionally, never hoarded. One evening, I stayed late in the group room. The chairs were still in a circle. There was a drawing on the whiteboard. One of the kids had sketched their version of a resilience ladder. It had flames under it and clouds above it. They wrote, "The ladder looks scary, but it's better than the fire." I smiled. That kid got it. That's what therapy is. That's what life is. Climbing, even when you're scared. Choosing the unknown path upward, rather than staying in the burning place you already know. That's what I had done. I never saw Dr. Kern again. Last I heard, he had moved into consulting. Quiet roles. Behind-the-scenes work. No speaking gigs. No publications. No more stolen spotlights. But I didn't need closure. I had patience. I had a team. I had peace. And on the wall in our clinic lobby, framed in simple black wood, we mounted a single quote. "Innovation is not what you take. It's what you give away and still keep." Because that's the thing about truth. When you speak it, when you live it, you don't need revenge. You just need time. And eventually, it speaks for you. If this story moved you, or reminded you of a time when your voice was ignored, don't stay silent. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Have you ever had your work stolen or your voice dismissed? And if you believe real change starts with truth, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories that fight for justice, resilience, and healing. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is letting the truth speak for itself.